Buddy, it's Charlie. This is the podcast To Hell and Back. Notice that I didn't even get the name of it right, and yet it's been the name of my podcast for 5 years. 5 years. 2017 I started, and so that's one reason is that I've been sort of out of commission, off duty on the illness injured list or something like that for the last year and a half, practically, while the pandemic went on and while I was attending to other things. And now I'm back. To Hell and Back is back. And but things are different now. So I've got headphones, which I never had before. Look at these. These are Dr. Dre Beats. Ever see these? You probably did, but I'm not very familiar with them. These are my son Ruben's headphones, and he said they'd be better quality than anything I was looking at. So here we go. Now I'll be able to hear. And I've got this microphone, which I've never had. So I've got this sort of thing that's really like trying to get right in my face, and it's a little bit distracting. Oh, and one other thing. If you watched a podcast that I posted already, or that I'm going to post, because I'm just starting to post these. I did one a couple of weeks ago, and I wore this hat. So here's my hat. See, this lovely silver hat. And I explained then that I got it at a senior art project of a student at Smith College who I have worked with. And she did this art project where you are mindful of objects. And she put like 1,000 objects in a room on the floor. And then anybody who came, you'd sit there in a chair and look at the objects and be mindful of them and think about them and see what object calls out to you, which object calls out to you. And this hat called out to me. And then you're supposed to take it with you and it's yours. And then you just leave a note card explaining why you took it. So I left a note card. I took this. I've had it for quite a few weeks now. And I sometimes wear it at my DBT skills group, which is a Zoom. And what I wrote was, I don't know why I took it. And I still don't know exactly why I took it, but I have figured out, I've made progress in the last couple of weeks, because I've figured out that the reason I took it is that there's some way in which it is a counterpoint to the rest of my personality. But then Nicole, who I'm about to introduce to you, pointed out to me that actually this is not entirely true, that there are other things I do that are kind of on the irreverent edge, so this hat is not the only thing that I don't understand and that I do spontaneously without knowing what I'm doing. But I really thought I'd keep wearing this hat until I understand it, at least. I thought it might represent sort of a political opposition to me, or maybe a gender opposition to me, or just sort of something different. And I don't know quite what it is. So, but it goes nicely with my headphones, I hope you think. I'm talking to you, when I say you, by the way, I'm talking to all of you, anybody who's listening to this or anybody who happens to be watching it on YouTube. And who you are, in my mind, is a whole wide spectrum of people. I don't know who you are, of course, though I'd love to hear who you are, and I'd love to get input from you through any means possible, including my website, where it's possible to leave me messages. And maybe you can put comments wherever you're listening to the podcast. But I would love to hear, because I want to figure out who I'm talking to. But who I tend to be talking to is anybody who experiences suffering in their lives, anybody who experiences adversity in their lives, which is kind of a large group of people, probably all humans, for instance. I don't know if it goes beyond human, but I think this could be all humans could potentially benefit from some of the messages that I'm intending to do, because everybody gets into hell and everybody has to get back from hell. And that's what this is all about, using DBT, dialectical behavior therapy, and other frameworks of thinking in order to deal with that. So hello, welcome back. Welcome to my new technology. I actually even have 2 lights, as if it's like a television studio in front of me that you can't see. And so it's really, I'm distracted. Sorry to go on about that. So I want to introduce Nicole. Nicole, who you, if you're watching this, you can also see, and if you're listening to this, you will shortly hear. Nicole is joining me as a co-host, and we're figuring out what that means as we go. This is our first time. And but it isn't the first time we've had conversations, because we've been talking for several years actually about DBT, about dialectics, about suffering, about getting in and out of hell, and various other things that she brings from her world. Because she's a different generation than me. She's comes from a different place than me. I come from the West Coast. She comes from the East Coast. And yet we've had really interesting conversations. And I just thought that'd be really a nice addition to this. And so we're going to figure out how to make best use of that as we go along. So you can look forward to that. And I hope you find it useful and interesting and compelling to listen to, because we would like to be able to have you and your friends and your family and your dog listen, anybody listen, that wants to listen. So Nicole, I want to welcome you to the podcast.
Thank you so much, Charlie. Hi, all to Hell and Back listeners, past, present, and future. I'm so honored and thrilled to be here. And I will do a quick little introduction of myself and my background, maybe more formally than I will usually speak about myself. I guess I can say that I am a lifelong student of the human condition, maybe the human drama of hell and heaven and all the spaces in between. I got my bachelor's in political science at Brown University and pursued my interest in policy ethics through the first year at Columbia Law School. But I discovered that I really enjoyed grappling with complex social issues, but didn't really like that win-lose, guilty, not guilty dichotomy of the law. And I've been a lifelong practitioner of yoga and Buddhism, and I sought a more holistic and creative approach to social change. And around that time, I became really interested in dialectics, dialectical behavioral therapy, and I also I left to pursue a full-time career as an actor. And during that period, it became increasingly clear to me that social transformation really arises from our cultural habits. And I increasingly began to see art as a mirror and a change agent that's dependent on our uniquely human capacity for imagination and connection. Also, at that time, I was working as a volunteer at a suicide crisis prevention hotline, and I became more and more interested in life on the margins, in trauma, and the relationship between culture and our individual experiences of suffering. And I thought that I wanted to be a DBT therapist. And I went into social work school, and I found that similarly to law school, it really did lack the creative space, the opportunities for innovation and experimentation that I was really looking for. And because technology was such a driving part of my experience of living in the world, and it seemed to be such a driving force in how we were all interacting with each other, and it was largely absent, if not entirely absent, in my social work experience, I instead went and got a master's in integrated media arts at NYU's Tisch. And now I am what I like to call a wellness artist and social experience designer. So really looking to help people transform extreme emotions, interpersonal conflict, and systemic obstacles into awareness-rich opportunities for intentional future building in creative ways.
Wow. Wow, you just enlightened me about things. I didn't think of all of those things. But you also, did you say along the way that you also have been doing coaching with people on a regular basis for a while, right?
I like to call coaching wellness art and social experience design.
Oh, okay. Okay.
Yes, that is part of what I do is coaching. And because coaching, life coaching, or wellness art, as I like to call it, is an unregulated industry, which gives a lot of room for a different kind of intervention or experience creation. And it's a really interesting space to be working in right now. And yeah, so that's where I'm living right now. That's what I'm creating in right now, and really bridging, I would say, like, I'm kind of trying to bridge somatics, mindfulness, psychology, social innovation, creative technology, and the performing arts.
Mm, mm. Great, great. It's and those of you who are just watching on podcasts, I mean, listening on a podcast, but you're not watching, don't see that actually she's of a different generation than me. I'm going to let you guess whether she's like 30 years older or 30 years younger than me, but whatever it is. Anyway,
Timeless.
timeless.
Timeless. I'm now at an age where I care about my age.
All right, so here's what I want us to move into talking about something today that probably will be beyond just today. So I'm going to start by just going back a step for those of you who haven't listened before, but also for those of you who have listened. It doesn't hurt to hear something that you already somewhat know, but don't. And that is that dialectical behavior therapy is a treatment that really grew out of the experience of one woman suffering, Marcia Linehan, and two podcasts ago, I actually told somewhat the story of this. So if you want to zoom back, you can find more on kind of the origin story of DBT. But you know, where the rubber meets the road for me is that she was 19 or 20 years old and she was in a psychiatric hospital for 2 years. She was harming herself. She was trying to kill herself. She was suffering every day. She didn't know how she would make it through. By the way, one of the most important things that saw her through was people who didn't know how to help her, but they knew how to be kind. And so that's just sort of a message that I've always maintained, because I don't always know immediately how to help people, but kindness goes a long ways in the meantime. Anyway, so Linehan, at a certain key moment in that hospitalization, she said to herself, if I ever get out of hell, this emotional hell, this suicidal hell, if I ever get out of this hell, I'm going to go back in and get all the others out. It was very moving to me. I mean, Marcia, she and I became friends in the late 1980s when I learned about her treatment and went out to Seattle, started to get to know about it and started to learn it and incorporate it in what I was doing. But it was so moving that somebody at age 20 stated her life mission like that. And it was such a compelling mission. I mean, she's always used metaphors in her treatment, but this was, get everybody else out of hell. And she meant get everybody else out who was suffering emotionally like she was. And in fact, that's what she has remained true to this day, is that's what she's done. And she's changed the world by developing this treatment. And if you don't know much about this treatment, there's lots of places to find out about it, but including lots of the episodes of this podcast in the past. So I learned this treatment, and one of the key things about getting people out of hell is still the mission, and that's my mission with you. Any of you who are in hell, any of you who were in hell yesterday, or you're going to be in hell tomorrow, I'm hoping that this podcast just gives you some free access to some ways to think about that and things that you can do. And from previous feedback I've gotten from people over the last 4 to 5 years, it seems that it does hit the spot for a lot of people. Now, I want to link DBT. Obviously, this brilliant woman put together this treatment for suicide, which is kind of the ultimate individual psychology problem, personality problem, human problem, the problem of suicide, which philosophers have struggled with. But she was struggling with at a very level of how to help people who are struggling with suicide. By the way, one of the most valuable things that she did early on in developing DBT was to define DBT not as a way to prevent suicide, but as a way to build a life in which suicide would become more or less irrelevant, because you'd have a life that was meaningful. Rather than saying, let's do everything we can do to have you not kill yourself, it was not, no, let's do everything we can do to help you get to a life that would be meaningful to you, whatever the heck that is. And so let's work on that. So that always also captivated me. So she did that. That's the goal of this, and other people who practice DBT. That's their goal too. So it feels like part of a large community that keeps growing around the world. Now, let me jump to something that won't be obvious to you why first, but I was teaching many years ago, maybe 5 years ago. I was doing a DBT workshop for therapists in Buffalo, New York. And I thought it was a good workshop for 2 days. People seemed to receive it well. And I had good conversations with people, a lot of teaching. And this woman came up afterwards, and she just looked at me and she said, I really, really enjoyed the workshop, but just let me say this, don't take our guns away. And I thought, what? Like, I don't think I mentioned the word gun. I don't think I thought of a gun. I don't think I thought of firearms. I don't think I thought of anything related to firearms, but there must have been something about where she was coming from while she's sitting, listening about DBT. And she says, don't take our guns away. And I said, I certainly wouldn't even dream of it. But it really connected with me. And I've never forgotten that moment because, obviously in the United States, we are in a massive discussion, national dialogue, and breakdown of politics about gun violence and what to do about these mass murders, even of, as my son Ruben said to me couple of weeks ago, he said, I can understand people going around shooting each other. People get really pissed and people have guns and stuff. But he said, but I don't understand that somebody would go into a classroom of third graders and kill them. Like, I don't get that. And of course, I don't get that either. I mean, if I knew that individual who did it, maybe I'd get to know more about it. But it's sort of like, wow. And so we're in the middle of this incredible debate, which has its extreme elements and then it has its moderate elements. But the extreme elements seem to be, on the one side, the person who says, I believe in the Second Amendment. Do not take my guns away. Do not restrict my access to guns. Do not change the rules about licensing guns or registering guns.
Can I interrupt? May I interrupt you?
Absolutely.
Up until just that last minute, because I want to just reflect on what you said about Marcia.
Sure.
And I think what was so compelling was that what she really did is she looked at this problem of suicide, this kind of, quintessential expression of, you could say, wicked problem in humanness, of complexity, of really reaching a point of no return where the only solution seems to be to opt out. And she redefined the problem. She said it's not about really preventing the suicide. She framed it differently. And it's like, and she really looked at the nature of the suffering, right? And she said, all right, well, what's the nature of the suffering? It's maybe it's a lack of meaning or a lack of access to meaning. So how do we create and give access? How do we help people create and give them access to a life worth living? And I think that it's worth looking at with gun control. What is the problem? I think it's, maybe the easy analogy to make with suicide is like, yes, there are mass shootings and there are gun deaths. And I think the direct linear answer is, okay, well, let's just take away everyone's guns, or let's barricade the schools, depending on which side of this you're on. But I'm curious what you think, and kind of maybe underneath all of this, what is the nature of the suffering? What is the problem in our country in this moment in time where we are not just having this exponential rise in violent gun violence or whatever, in violent gun violence, in gun violence, but we're also having a rise in the amount of people that are buying personal guns, and really an inability to have conversations. I mean that's one of the reasons I think it's such an interesting and difficult problem, is that there's a real polarization about what the problem is, what the solution is, with two completely different perspectives.
Yeah, and And I think one of the things that has paralyzed being able to figure that out, and by the way, you're the one who probably 2 years ago brought to my attention what the nature of wicked problems, which I then went and read about, and I've been interested in ever since. And so this problem about gun violence meets all the criteria that people have laid out of a wicked problem. So it's very hard to define a wicked problem. That's actually one of the characteristics of it. It's very hard to define what would be the solution to a wicked problem. That's okay. It's very hard to see the boundaries of a wicked problem because it actually intersects with multiple other wicked problems. So I think that what we have in gun violence is a wicked problem in that it's hard to define, because if you define it from the point of view of you're one of the sort of at the edge of don't take my guns away, then you're going to define it in one way. Right. If you're at the edge of take away their guns, you're at the other edge of this problem, and you're going to define it as a different problem. And if you're standing outside both of those people as a third observer saying, oh, look at this terrible problem, these people can't talk to each other, they're doing each other in, you're going to define a different problem. So it's actually a very complicated mess. Actually, by the way, when I read about wicked problems, there's people who've defined messy problems or problem of big messes that actually sort of overlaps with what wicked problems are. They're a little different, but a wicked problem, suicide is a wicked problem for most people who kill themselves, because by the time they kill themselves, there are multiple other problems bleeding into the suicidal problem. It never stands alone. Yeah. And it's really hard to solve. So Linehan had this brilliant way of grabbing hold of people and saying, what would make your life meaningful, not what would make you stop killing yourself. And that was different at the time, and it really is different. So about this, what's the problem? I mean, I think the problem, Nicole, I was actually, to be graphic about this, I was lying in my shorts in my backyard of my house, looking at the sky, literally yesterday, thinking about this podcast and thinking about this topic. And I was thinking, I started to think, if from a dialectical point of view, even though we haven't started talking about dialectics, many people know about it, it's in previous podcasts, but from a dialectical point of view, one thing you have to be able to do is to observe your own thoughts. You have to say, here's what I think about this, and realize that there are alternatives, that your thoughts are not the only game plan for this particular situation. Your thoughts are one take on a big situation. And then if you can have that perspective, then you can say, oh, look at that guy over there. Okay. Like I had an Uncle David. Yeah. I mean, he was a gun owner. He had been an FBI agent. He was a hunter. He had guns at his house. I'd go to my cousin's house. They'd be there. I mean, and I thought, oh man, Uncle Dave has guns and stuff. And Uncle Dave does this and Uncle Dave, I thought, but I know that Uncle Dave was then and probably would be now one of those people who would say, do not take my guns away. Yep. Do not take my freedom away. Do not take my independence away. Do not take my manhood away. Do not sideline me, you people from Massachusetts and New York, you sort of people who are elite liberals, and you think you know better than I do about my own life. Come and tell me about that when I can't get out of the middle class, or I can't even get up to the middle of the middle class. So the economic problems are in the middle of this problem. The problems of watching television and watching social media and getting caught in one or another echo chamber where you actually don't even see, like last night on television, I don't know if you watched it, but the hearings about the January 6th insurrection went on, and Fox News chose not to show it. They're the only channel that showed. They didn't want their people to see it. And not only that, Tucker Carlson, when he was on, they chose to run his whole hour without any commercial breaks because they didn't want to lose people to switch over. So, and I'm not vilifying them, because you could say the same things about people who are more on the left, like MSNBC, but it's sort of like we've got these echo chambers where it's really hard to have this dialogue with Uncle Dave.
Absolutely. Well, I think that without a doubt, I mean, I think if we try and contextualize this moment in time and we look at what the landscape, like who is living with what information, Like,
Mm,
we don't all share the same experience of reality with the same kinds of information
mm,
in the way that we did 5 years ago, 10 years ago, certainly not 20 years ago. I mean, within the course of my lifetime, what it means to consume information, to have the facts, has changed dramatically. And I think that continues to be that in and of itself is a really, really complex and an interesting issue. And I think that even if we take that away, which we can't really do, but even if we pull away the kind of partisan sniping about and where the coverage is, and we look at like who is buying guns and why,
mhm,
and then who is fighting guns and why, and if we just look at the map, the people that are buying guns are in the middle of the country. They're in more rural areas. They have a pretty specific demographic profile. And then the people that are fighting guns are, they tend to be in more urban areas. They tend to have a higher level of education, and they tend to have different, just different jobs. So what I found that was really interesting that I didn't know was that a lot of people that buy guns buy them for personal protection.
mhm,
So if you think about the nature of the suffering, on one hand, if you're buying guns because you think they're going to keep you safe, you
mhm,
really believe that owning a gun is going to keep you safe and someone's going to take your safety away from you.
mhm.
I mean, if I'm just trying to put my mind in the position of that person, because, I live in New York City. Do I think that a gun is going to keep me safe? I'm terrified of guns. You know, um, I've held a gun one time, and actually, I went to, I think, a gun range in New York City as a birthday thing. And I was terrified. I was going to shoot the wrong person.
Mm.
That's the range of my experience. But,
Did you, wait, did you have an idea of who the right person would be?
I think the target was there was no right person.
Oh,
He was
okay.
like, just get in the direction of the target and make sure nothing is misfiring. But
All
the
right.
whole time I'm
All
like,
right.
oh my gosh, I hear these things go off the wrong way all the time. Like,
Right.
yeah, no, definitely. Like, I mean, I'm a little skittish, but like, if I believe that my safety, like right now, I'm in a house by myself. I'm a woman. Like, I don't usually stay at a house by myself. Like, there have been times where it's late at night and I hear scary noises, and like, I don't want to be like, oh, poor me. But like, I can imagine if I lived in the middle of nowhere, there might
Absolutely.
be some, and if I'm like, this is my life. I'm out here in the country and this is my daily experience, and you want to take away what keeps me safe, because nobody's going to be like driving up to take care of me in 30 seconds the way they do in New York City. So I mean, that's a different experience of reality than the people that live in the cities that are saying, are you crazy? Get rid of these guns. Who needs them? So it's
No,
just an interesting thing, even if we take away the media bias and these kind of echo chambers,
yeah.
to live. I mean, our country, the map, where we have the red and blue, where the red is kind of in the center and the geography of the center, the demographics of the center versus what's on the periphery. It's like, they're different countries.
Yeah. And I think that when you're somebody who has held a gun once, I'm probably ahead of you by having held a gun 2 or 3 times. But I grew up around guns, but I never was drawn to guns. But
Yeah.
I was part of a culture in Oregon, fairly small town, rural Oregon, where everybody had guns. And so, but I do think you would have to, if you're going to be dialectical as part of your thinking about this, you would have to ask exactly what you're asking and find out, what is that person experiencing? Because you already know what it's like to be a person who's afraid of there being more guns. You already know what it's like to be a person who thinks that the mass shootings are horrible. And you're already a person maybe who has that whole broad set of beliefs. But then it means that, like, when I work with a patient and I need to use dialectics, and I have a patient who is really different than me, and he or she is sitting opposite me, and we are stuck, and they feel misunderstood by me, or they just feel I don't get it. At a certain point, when I just have to drop my whole shtick and say, you know what? I just got to get in there where you are. I got to get in there where you are. Could you just talk for a while about what it's like to be you? I mean, with the guns, you'd have to say, can you just talk for a while about the good news about having guns? Because guns scare me. And I think, but I realize that that's my perspective on life. And if I had grown up where you grew up, I'd probably feel different. So tell me about it. And then you'd have to really listen. And my own criteria for that is listen and listen and listen and ask and ask and ask until you get to the point where you say, oh, got it. Of course you want guns.
Right.
Of course you want an AR-15. Of course that makes, God, I've suddenly.
It makes so much sense.
And then you can have a dialogue. Before that, it's like, sniping. It's like what's going on, back and forth. But it's kind of like, then you can say, oh my God, I feel like running out right now and getting some guns because I hardly have any. And what if somebody comes into my house? And so I think it's important. And what happens is that we get caught listening only to the people that talk like us. And then we don't hear the other person. Or if we do, we only hear the extreme ones that get above the noise. And then you hear the extreme ones that on both sides of the fence could be kind of crazy at the edge, because extremes kill. And one of the things that Linehan learned and built into DBT is that extremes, you have to move from extremes towards the middle. And of what kind of emotions, what kind of thoughts, what kind of actions you have. And that doesn't mean you just become sort of Mr. Milquetoast or something, moving towards the middle or getting some compromise formation. No, it's like you actually get that there are people who are passionate about guns for many reasons. And there's people who are passionate about having gun control or restrictions. I almost know nobody who says all guns should be taken away, though that the way it's portrayed in the extreme versions is as if somebody's saying that particular thing. I just never hear that. Now, maybe some people are saying that, but I think the original view of the Second Amendment, if you read the very tiny statement that's the Second Amendment, it's just a sentence. It doesn't say all this stuff about it. Just says that people have a right to bear arms as part of securing their freedom, to protect themselves, to defend themselves and their family, basically, is what it was meant to be. And it didn't mean you should be able to have this many guns or do that many or not have any restrictions. All of that is kind of like become part of the extremist dialogue. But
so let me ask you this really quickly. So how do you get to a place that's a little bit that's beyond your own confirmation bias? So, like when you're particularly if it's something that maybe you do have that does poke you a little bit, when you're working with someone and you do believe that you're right, because I think that for all of us, when we're, there are areas where we're all a little bit more open and we're like, yeah, okay, I can see that maybe there's an argument there, but then there are areas where like, no, there's just no reason. I mean, I can say with like assault weapons, I just don't, that's a harder one for me. And, that was your example. But so when you're working with the patient and, there's just something that seems wrong, like where you have a judgment and you have a lot of evidence that's just flooding in about why.
The way I think about that, and let's use the AR-15 example, or some assault weapons with large magazine capacities and these things that really are made for mass murder and war, right? So why does an individual need that? And the way I think about that is that I might not be able to get all the way into the foxhole of the person and saying, yes, God damn it, I need an AR-15. However, there is a human being there who has arrived at that, and is one of millions of human beings who've arrived at that, and who articulate that, well, it's a gun that's really good for killing varmints in my yard. It's a gun for, I was hearing a woman talking about it the other day. She said, you know, this gun is amazing because it's only like 5 pounds instead of a 20-pound assault weapon. So you can hold this thing. You literally, I, as a woman, if an intruder came in my house, I could pick it up in 2 seconds and it would be ready to go. And I could aim it and shoot it, which I could not do if it was a rifle or a bigger thing. And a handgun, I'm not sure that I could hold steady. And now I've learned, so the AR-15 is really a great defend my family weapon. And so I was just listening to that because I'm trying to drop my own biases enough to hear why somebody would end up there. But Nicole, I think people, even if somebody ends up at a position that you could never buy, you could never side with, you could never quite see the full wisdom as, or even a position that's like based on lies. They're still, they got there. How did they get to that position? What were the motivating forces that led a whole large contingent of people, like 20 million in the country, to need assault weapons in their neighborhood? Like, how did that happen? Where does that come from? So I think there's a lot of valid antecedents to that final decision to go to the gun store and get an AR-15.
So then you're looking at the system. Right. So then you're looking more systemically and you're kind of looking at like, all right, what's the relationship here, the kind of causal relationships here that are informing these decisions, that are making and kind of validating. So when we're looking at the kernel of truth on both sides, you're looking maybe at a broader framework than just maybe the end result.
Exactly. And I think it's part of being dialectical, because if you just look at the end results, then you're just stuck with this. One person is saying, God damn it, I deserve, I need, and I have, and do not take away this assault weapon. And the other person is saying, do you realize that's the weapon that was used to kill 19 children in a school in Texas, and all these children in Connecticut, and all these other people? Do you realize that those are, and that we should have those out of circulation? And because then you're getting two sort of, what would you call it, talking points that actually grow out of a much more complex
Of course. Well, I think what you're saying makes so much sense, because in terms of looking for, and wicked problems don't have solutions. They just have, kind of responses, because we don't have, clear, easily identifiable problems. There really are no solutions. There are just possible responses. And what that looks like, it just depends on really where you're standing and how you're framing the problem. So when we're talking about what possible solutions might look like, what possible responses might look like, and how, and those solutions or temporary interventions will cause new problems. I mean, that's part of the nature of these complex adaptive systems. So like when we're intervening at some point, it's going to create all these other changes. But what I like about the way you frame this is that, so when we kind of take this broader, more complex view of both sides of the dialectic, and then we can kind of see, all right, here's what's informing how both sides got to this place.
Exactly.
Then there are multiple points where we can intervene and make adjustments. It's a much kind of broader landscape to create solutions. It's because I do think it's easy to get very, very kind of calcified and to feel very, very stuck. And what dialectics is always about getting unstuck. So it's nicer to see it as a more spacious and expansive arena.
And I think it has to be. And when I was lying there in my shorts looking at the sky yesterday and thinking about this, what I did was I went on a whole rant myself, as if I was, one of my distant relatives that's really like a gun supporter, a Trump supporter, a right-wing conservative. I mean, because that's not where I'm at in the political spectrum. But on the other hand, I grew up around it. And also I went on a rant. I started to talk as if, I'm going to do a role play here. And the role play is that I am one of these people who is just fed up and sick about these people who are trying to restrict guns or find the way to do that. And it took me a while, but I started getting into it to the point where I was like, I was sort of like a modern day Archie Bunker shouting in my backyard. I mean, it's sort of like I'm going on listening to myself and thinking, that's the guy. And the more I did that, the more actually it pulled in other things. Like when I said earlier in this podcast that I said, yeah, and you're going to take my masculinity away, and you're going to take my independence away. You're going to take my freedom away. You're going to take my life away. You're going to take my family away. You're going to tax me to death. And why? To pay for people who are immigrants coming across the border and their lives because they don't have jobs, and pay for people who are sick because they didn't take care of themselves. I'm going to have my hard-earned small amount of money taken away by this government, and my guns are going to be taken away too. God damn it, you're not taking my guns away, because I've got, that's my last ditch thing. If you come as a government into my house, I want you to remember I have a gun.
So wait. But see, this is what I wonder. And because, I mean, I know, like, because that's not where you live politically, that I wonder, like, is your understanding of that person, like, is it to some extent a caricature of, of a type, how do we avoid when we're trying to step outside of maybe where we live, particularly because we do live in these kind of bubbles of information where we're
right.
constantly given, because what you described, and I think I still think it's so important that we all do all the time, but you described a pretty, this archetypical
right.
Republican, white, entitled, male, angry, like whatever that is. I'm a little bit more moderate than you are, that I think that it's not that simple. And I don't think that I think it's stereotypical rather than actually emblematic, I think, of the complexity of who that person is.
I agree with you. I totally agree with you. And I could hear it myself as I was doing it, because you have to inhabit the other person in order to be able to validate them, and in order to take them into account when you're thinking. So a caricature like that might not do it. Whereas as soon as you said that, Nicole, I thought about how my children, when they were growing up playing youth hockey, and they had a hockey coach over in Holyoke, Massachusetts, where Ruben was playing hockey. Yeah. And he had this coach who was like, I just thought he was God's gift to coaching and children. He was so good. He was such a good coach, so present, so playful, so devoted to teaching the kids to play hockey, so nice to them, and they all liked him. And online, I see him on Facebook. He is the most extreme, and he works at Smith Wesson, a gun company, and he's a real gun advocate, and he's an extreme right-wing person, and he writes this stuff that is the caricature. And then I think, how do I put this together with this man? I almost want to write him and say, thank you for coaching Ruben.
That's powerful.
You were so sweet. And then you have that. I don't quite get how you got from there to there, but there's something to be asked about how somebody gets from there to there.
Well, and I think we are all that complex in a lot of ways. I think that's actually what's misleading about the way, where we see these kind of fragments of each other, whether it's through social media or the way that we are portrayed, or the way that, the teams of right and left, or this type and that type. I think what we, when I'm trying to think about gun control, I think about a gun advocate being devastated about Uvalde. Like, I just think about someone to just think, like, I think about a mother, a father that's just like, but that still wants her gun, but that just doesn't see that as the problem.
Right.
Like, I really see that it's a human being that thinks it's just like disgusting and horrific. I mean, there's a lot, it's interesting because I think there's a lot of misinformation about mental illness, and that, where there's this real reflex to attribute mass shootings to mental illness, and there isn't real evidence for that. And this, belief that if, the mental, if the mental health care industry did a better job, then maybe we wouldn't have these kinds of issues. And that becomes a whole other kind of complex landscape. But I don't think that there's this, I don't know, I think that it is people like, Ruben's coach that really believe in the same way that you believe, and the same way that, the parents of the victims believe, that like that they're doing the right thing.
Right.
And I think that that's what makes these questions so challenging and important, and like finding different ways to have these conversations, because what creates and perpetuates the polarization is seeing each other as other,
Yeah.
rather than as, other, rather than as human beings just like us, that if we were in those same conditions and we lived that way and we had the, that we would be that way too.
Well, and also their experience when you're outside of somebody else's
Yeah.
context and their life, your experience of even the thought of what if you had 6 guns
Right.
is like, wait a minute. I mean, and then if you were actually there, like Ruben and I did some teaching in Sweden and went and found my ancestors' homes from the 1800s. And but we stayed at a man's house who was a hospital administrator who became a friend. And he wanted to take me and Ruben hunting. And I didn't have much interest in hunting. Ruben definitely had interest in hunting. And we did target practice at night for the several days. And then on the weekend, we went hunting. All right. And what I noticed about this man, who is just as gentle and sweet and has 3 children, and they are just like very cool, and living out in rural area in Sweden. He didn't have to go far to go hunting, and or to jump in freezing cold water in November, by the way, and then go back in a shack where there was a sauna going. It's like back and forth, back and forth. It was quite an experience. But this man, he had all these guns, and they were all put away in a certain place. Totally comfortable with that. He grew up with that. His grandfather grew up with that. His grandfather grew up with that. It's like a part of life. And also it was obvious that he was careful with the guns and safe, but not at all shy, of course, about the guns. He uses them every week. So it's sort of like, you have to get what I like about what you did after I did this kind of caricature rant, because that caricature rant might not be a bad first step on your way in.
And I think it is important.
But then you realize, you know what? This is also that hockey coach. Yeah. This is also this person who's actually as much devoted to the protection, safety, and learning of children as anybody I had seen. And so it's like putting these things together is hard. It's hard in our own heads to get out of these sort of caricatured dialogues. And so, hey, I wanted to go back one other thing you said before. I do think that in the long run in this podcast, we'll be probably weaving in and out of the theme of what is dialectics, and what is a dialectical worldview? What are dialectical interventions and solutions and things like that? I just want to say that it is inherent to the definition of what dialectics is that it is a certain view of how one arrives at the truth. And the way you arrive at the truth is actually not to figure out what the truth is. There's a little paradox there. I mean, you arrive at the truth by continuing to ask what's left out, and you arrive at the truth by continuing to see oppositions emerging, and then seeing if you can see where they go from there, and that the truth is evolving. It never stops, and therefore, even the word solutions in a dialectical framework is a problematic word, I think. I think interventions is a good word.
Yeah.
Strategies is a good word. Tactics is a good word. But solutions, you may never have the solution to a problem. You just move the ball forward by continuing. So in our current situation, our dialogue, hopefully you and I, the dialogue we're having, and if it leads to other people to think about things or have other conversations about this topic in a certain way, hopefully that's a step in the direction of becoming more realistic, more complex, more flexible, more willing to look at both sides. which is
Well,
really the
yeah,
essence.
and I just want to just add to that because I think one of the, and I think it was like Horst Riddle that came up with the framework of, I think so, originally, like of wicked problems. And
Right.
it was a reaction to the kind of hyper professionalism and
Mm,
kind of the hyper siloed like expertise and I mean, it was, I guess, like the Industrial Revolution's version of nichification, but where problems were much simpler, and it was easier to kind of break down our world, the organization of our world, into the silos of problem solution.
mhm,
And there was this professionalization of everything. I think that
mhm,
was characteristic of the early 1900s.
mm,
But part of what happened was, as a result of creating solutions, all of these problems, and creating a much more interconnected, much more complex world. And you can argue it's always been interconnected, but in ways that just accelerated so quickly. The kind of the cause effect relationship is so, and now I think the way technology has impacted all of that, it's really beyond any of our kind of individual capacity to pinpoint. And language
mhm,
I mean, we use language in a way that's very concretized. It's very, it's this or that. And I think paradox is the nature of pretty much everything. So I think it's so valuable and so important to always acknowledge that we will use, that we label things as a certain way, but language is so limited. And we can latch on to something as being this static destination, but really it is just always part of a conversation. It is always part of this kind of interbeing, this
mhm.
evolving truth. And I think it's easy to forget when we're in these debates, particularly the way we talk about things collectively as a culture, when we're submitting policies and we're arguing and there's that side and this side or whatever, as though these things really exist,
Mm,
when it's much more ineffable than that.
mm, mm. Hey, I'm wanting us to stop in just a couple of minutes
Oh, yeah.
today. Because I think I informed you, I'm going to Boston Celtics game in the NBA Finals, which is how
What?
many?
You did not tell me. That's exciting.
Yeah, I have a ticket and with my sons for tonight to go to Boston. So we're going to go to there. So I have to leave fairly soon because there'll be
Yeah.
traffic and stuff. And and this is part of who I am. I'm sure I'll be bringing sports into the podcast sometimes. In fact, I have ideas about bringing people in who are athletes or trainers of athletes to talk about how do you help people get through, dig deep and get through pain and get through
Love that.
hardship, and because I think we have a lot to learn from those
I
people
agree.
too.
I agree.
So let me just say at the end that uh, yeah, I already said that I would like, both of us would appreciate getting feedback. And it's the first time that we've done this as a co-hosting thing. So you can give feedback on that too, though I think it's going to take us a while just to kind of get our feet on the ground doing this. I'm just excited about doing it. Very appreciative that Nicole's willing to do it and that we can get these conversations going. So anyway, we're going to stop and yeah, I'm tempted to say more, but then we aren't stopping. So we have
No,
to
I just
stop.
want to say thank you. Thank you. It was such a pleasure. And I'm so excited to be doing this.
Good. Yeah, very good. Great. Okay, so let's stop.